That was how Ethan Cole's afternoon changed forever. He had been riding the south fence line since early morning, the Texas sun pressing down on his shoulders like a hand that meant to flatten him into the red dirt. The land stretched in every direction, pale gold and burnt amber, cracked earth and brittle grass, the kind of country that asked everything of a man and gave back only what he was willing to fight for. Ethan had lived on this land his whole life. He knew its silences. He knew the way the wind changed direction before a storm, the way the cattle moved differently when something was wrong, the way the grass bent under weight it wasn't meant to carry. And he knew, the moment he heard it, that what carried across that still, scorching air was not the land speaking, it was a person. He pulled his horse to a stop, sat perfectly still in the saddle. The sound came again, barely a sound at all, more like the memory of one, fragile, desperate, the kind of sound a person makes when they have already used up everything they had, and this is what remains. It was coming from somewhere in the dry grass just beyond the shallow rise ahead of him. He dismounted slowly, looped the reins around a fence post, and walked forward on foot. Not quickly, not with the urgency that might startle whatever was waiting on the other side of that rise. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, how you move matters just as much as what you do when you arrive. What he found stopped him cold. A young woman lay in the grass, half curled on her side, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair matted with dust and dried blood along her hairline. She was conscious, barely, her eyes open and fixed on him the moment he crested the rise. And what he saw in those eyes was not relief, it was terror. "Don't!" she gasped, the words scraping out of her like something pulled from a place far deeper than her throat. She pressed herself backward into the grass, away from him, though every movement clearly caused her pain. Her hands found the ground behind her and pushed, uselessly, because there was nowhere left to go. "Don't come near me! Please, don't!" Ethan stopped where he stood. He did not take another step. He crouched down slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller, lowering himself to her level rather than standing over her like a shadow against the sun. He took his hat off and held it in both hands, and for a long moment he said absolutely nothing at all. He simply let her look at him, let her see his face, the lines of it, the stillness of it. Let her decide, in whatever small way she still could, what happened next. "I'm not going to touch you," he said. His voice was low and even, the way a man speaks when he is trying not to frighten something that has already been frightened past its limit. "My name is Ethan. I've got a ranch about a mile north of here. I'm not going to come any closer unless you ask me to." She stared at him. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Her eyes moved over his face the way a person reads something they're not sure they can trust, slowly, carefully, looking for the lie. "I'm going to set some water down," he continued, "and a cloth, right here between us, and then I'm going to step back." He moved only as much as he had to, reached into his saddlebag without standing, retrieved his canteen and the clean rag he kept folded there, and placed them in the grass halfway between them. Then he stood slowly and took 3 deliberate steps back. He counted them so she could count them too. She watched every movement, every inch of every step. Slowly, so slowly it was almost painful to observe, she reached out and drew the canteen toward her. Ethan looked away. He turned his eyes to the horizon and kept them there, fixed on the place where the pale sky met the pale earth in a line so thin it barely existed. He listened to the wind moving through the dry grass. He listened to the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere high above. He listened to the small, desperate sounds of a person drinking water like it was the first real thing they had touched in days. and he waited with the patience of a man who understood deeply and without needing to be told that some things cannot be rushed without being broken entirely. After a long while, her voice came again, still thin, still carrying the tremor of fear beneath every word, but slightly steadier than before. "Clara," she said. He didn't turn immediately, gave it a breath, too, then looked back at her quietly, his expression unchanged. "Clara," he repeated, as though simply confirming that he had heard her. Nothing more than that. No follow-up questions, no pushing forward. She had pressed the wet cloth to her forehead, and some of the wildness had left her eyes, though the fear had not gone, only retreated slightly, like a tide pulling back just far enough to allow a single breath. She was young, younger than he had first thought, and beneath the dust and the dried blood and the rawness of everything she had clearly been through, there was something else in her face, something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze that told him she had survived things before this, that she knew in some deep and weary part of herself how to endure. "I'm not going back," she said. Not to him exactly, more to the open sky above her, more to whatever was listening beyond the reach of either of them. "I don't care what happens. I'm not going back." Ethan said nothing for a moment. The wind moved between them. Then, carefully, he removed his coat, a worn canvas duster, sun-faded and soft from years of hard use, and walked 2 slow steps closer. He stopped. "I'm going to lay this down beside you. The sun's going to dip in another hour, and the heat goes fast out here once it does." He set it down within her reach and stepped back without being asked. She looked at the coat for a long time. The wind lifted one edge of it slightly, gently, as if offering it to her. Then she reached out and pulled it over herself slowly, and something in her face shifted in a way that was almost invisible, the kind of change that happens when a person touches something safe for the first time in so long they had almost forgotten what safety felt like. Not happiness, not yet, something quieter than that, something that was simply the absence of bracing. He carried her to the ranch with careful, deliberate hands, his grip only where it had to be, his eyes straight ahead, his steps measured and slow across the uneven ground. He walked the horse rather than mounting behind her, leading it by the reins through the dry fields as the afternoon light began its long, golden descent toward the horizon. She held the saddle horn and said nothing, and he did not fill the silence with words it didn't need. The ranch was modest, but deeply cared for. A white farmhouse with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, a barn that had been leaning slightly to the left for 30 years and showed no signs of stopping, and flower boxes in the windows, dusty now, empty of blooms, that spoke of a woman's touch that was no longer present. Ethan's wife, Margaret, had planted flowers in those boxes every spring without exception. She had been gone 11 years. The flower boxes had stayed, because taking them down had never once felt like the right thing to do. He brought Clara inside and showed her to the room at the end of the hall. Clean curtains on the window, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed that Margaret had made the winter before she got sick. He left towels and a change of clothes on the chair by the door, things from the cedar chest that had stayed folded and untouched, and something in him felt quietly certain that using them now was right, that Margaret, who had been the most generous woman he had ever known, would have wanted exactly this. "Door locks from the inside," he told her, from the hallway, his hand still on the outer knob. "I'll be in the kitchen. You don't have to talk. You don't have to explain anything. You don't have to do a single thing except rest." He pulled the door most of the way closed and left her to it. She slept for most of that first day. He heard her once in the deep middle of the night, a sharp sound cut short, the sound of someone waking suddenly from somewhere terrible and then going very still. He sat up in his own room and listened, heard nothing more, lay back down and stared at the ceiling until the sky outside the window began its slow shift from black to gray. In the morning, she did not come to the kitchen. He left a plate covered with a cloth on the small table by her door and went about his work without comment. The second morning, she stood in the kitchen doorway while he made coffee. He didn't turn around, just reached for a second cup from the shelf, filled it, and set it on the counter where she could reach it without having to come further into the room than she wanted to. He went back to his own cup and looked out the window at the yard. She stayed in the doorway for a while. Then, quietly, she came and took the cup. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen and drank their coffee and said nothing, and the morning moved around them slowly, full of ordinary sounds, the creak of the house settling, the call of birds outside, the distant low of cattle in the east pasture. On the third morning, she sat at the kitchen table. On the fourth, she asked if there was anything she could do to help. He told her the garden needed watering if she felt up to it. She was outside for 2 hours. When she came back in, her hands were dirty and her shoulders were slightly less tight than they had been. She flinched still, at the screen door swinging on its hinge, at the sound of a pan set down too firmly, at the crack of the wood in the fireplace when the evening cooled and he lit it for the first time. Each time, Ethan gave no reaction. He simply continued whatever he was doing, steady and unhurried, letting the ordinary rhythm of the days do what words never could. He understood, without needing to examine it, that what she needed most was not reassurance, it was consistency. The same man, behaving the same way, day after day, until her body slowly began to believe what her mind was still afraid to trust. On the fifth evening, she stood at the window after supper and watched the last of the light leave the sky, and he saw her reach up and touch the curtain Margaret had sewn, just the edge of it, lightly, with 2 fingers, and then let it go. On the 6th morning, she came to the porch before he did and sat in the second chair, the one that had been empty since Margaret. He brought 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without a word, and sat in his chair and watched the sun come up over the east pasture, turning the grass from gray to gold in slow, spreading waves. "He's my stepfather," she said after a long while. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, and her voice was flat and precise, the voice of someone who has gone over a truth so many times it no longer has the power to destroy them, only to hurt. "Daniel Reeves. He owns half the county, the way most people tell it. Generous at church, good with a handshake and a smile, the kind of man other men trust on sight." She paused. "Nobody believes what happens behind the doors." Ethan wrapped both hands around his cup, said nothing. "He'll come here," she said. "He'll come and he'll be polite and he'll say the right things in the right order, and most people will hand me right back to him without a second thought." Ethan looked at her then with the full steadiness of his attention. "I'm not most people," he said. She turned and met his eyes, and for just a moment, just a breath, something in her face opened slightly, like a window cracked just enough to let in air. The rider came on the 7th day, a boy from town, 15 at most, riding hard up the lane with his hat nearly blown clean off his head by the speed of it. He pulled up at the porch steps breathing like he'd run the whole way himself. "Mr. Cole," he managed between gasps. "Daniel Reeves is coming. Got 2 men riding with him. They're saying the girl is his, and they mean to bring her back." Clara went completely still beside Ethan. Not the stillness of fear this time, something harder than that. Something that had been building quietly in her for 7 days of coffee and garden dirt and curtains in the morning light. Ethan thanked the boy and sent him safely on his way. Then he stood for a moment on the porch steps, looking out at the empty lane, at the dust still settling where the boy's horse had been. He turned to Clara. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set in that way he had first noticed when she lay in the grass with nothing left, that deep, immovable core of her that no one had managed to break. "You can go inside," he said quietly. "You don't have to be here for this." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at the lane. "I'm tired of hiding," she said, quietly, completely. He nodded once. "All right." He sent word to 2 neighbors, men he had known for 40 years, men whose handshake meant exactly what it said. And by the time Daniel Reeves' dust cloud appeared on the far end of the lane, there were 3 additional horses tied at Ethan's fence, and 3 additional men standing in the yard with the particular stillness of people who have already made their decision and are simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Daniel Reeves was precisely what Clara had described, and somehow still worse for being seen in person. He rode in looking like a portrait of respectability, clean shirt, easy posture, the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to force his way into a room because every room has always opened for him. He dismounted with a kind of practiced grace and walked toward the porch with his hat in his hand and a smile that reached everywhere except his eyes. "Ethan," he said warmly, as though they were neighbors meeting at a county fair, "I believe you've been kind enough to shelter my daughter. There's been a misunderstanding. She gets confused sometimes, frightened, and I've come to bring her home where she belongs." "She's not your daughter," Ethan said, "and there's been no misunderstanding." Something moved behind Daniel's eyes, barely visible, like a current beneath still water, but the smile held. "She's a troubled girl," he said, his voice carrying the gentle, patient tone of a man accustomed to being believed. "She needs her family. I'm sure you can understand that." "I understand what I've seen," Ethan said, "and I understand that she came to me of her own choosing. She'll leave the same way, if she decides. That decision belongs to her. It doesn't belong to you. It never did." The smile thinned, just slightly, just enough to show the edge of something beneath it. "You're making an error, Ethan, involving yourself in a family matter you don't fully understand. That's not a wise position for a man in your situation." "No," Ethan said, just the one word, flat and final and immovable as the red earth beneath them. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of the sound of wind, of horses shifting their weight, of men who were not going to move. Daniel looked at them one by one, slowly, calculating. His men behind him were watching his hands, waiting for a signal. Then he looked at Clara. She was standing beside Ethan on the porch steps, her hands at her sides, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that had not been there 7 days ago. She did not look away, she did not flinch, she simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they have decided, finally and completely, to stop being afraid of. Something passed across Daniel's face in that moment, something that was not quite anger and not quite defeat, but lived in the cold space between them. He looked at her for a long time, long enough to make it felt. Then he placed his hat back on his head with the same practiced ease, adjusted the brim, and turned back to Ethan. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, almost pleasantly, the smile entirely gone now. "When it continues, we'll be here," Ethan replied. He held his gaze for one more beat, the kind of beat designed to unsettle, to plant a seed of doubt, to remind a man that consequences have long memories. Then he turned and walked back to his horse without another word. His men followed. They rode down the lane at an unhurried pace, and that unhurriedness was itself a kind of threat, the message of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. The dust settled slowly behind them. Clara let out a breath beside Ethan, long and slow and deep, from somewhere that had been holding it for far longer than 7 days. The men in the yard exchanged quiet looks and began to make their way to their horses, and Ethan thanked each of them by name, and each of them nodded and said some version of the same thing, that they'd be back if needed, that the word only had to be sent. When they were gone, the quiet that returned was different from every quiet that had come before it, cleaner, like air after rain. "He'll try again," Clara said. "Maybe," Ethan said, "but not today. And when he does, he'll find the same thing he found today." She looked at him, fully, openly, the way she had not quite been able to before. And for the first time since the dry grass and the broken voice and the coat laid down without touching, the fear was not the first thing in her eyes. There was something else there, something quiet and new and carefully held. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head, just slightly. "You did the hard part," he told her. "You asked for help. In my experience, that's the hardest thing there is." She stayed through the autumn and into the winter. She tended the garden until the frost came and learned the name of every horse in the barn and proved herself more capable than she had ever been permitted to show. She wrote letters with the help of a neighbor's wife, plain, careful, truthful letters that found their way to people with the authority to act on them. And it turned out that Daniel Reeves had collected enemies the way some men collect debts, quietly, over years, each one patient and waiting for the moment when the weight of them all became too much to carry. The truth, once it began to move, moved the way water moves through cracked ground, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. It was not a single dramatic moment that undid him. It was quieter than that, more methodical, the way real justice usually works, when it works at all. Spring came the way it always did to that part of Texas, tentatively at first, a little green pushing through the cracked earth, mornings that were still cold but held the faint promise of warmth if you stood in the sun long enough. The flower boxes on the porch were full again. Clara had filled them herself in late February with the same kind of flowers Margaret had always planted. She had not known that. She had simply chosen them because they seemed right. When Ethan noticed, he stood on the porch for a long moment and looked at them without speaking. Then he went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and sat in his chair, and Clara sat in hers, and the morning moved around them in its slow and ordinary and extraordinary way. He looked at her eventually, just looked at her, with the full and quiet attention of a man who has learned not to waste the moments that matter, and something in his chest that had been still for 11 years moved slightly, like the first green thing pushing through winter ground. He didn't say anything yet. Some things deserve to be approached slowly. Some things are too real and too good to be rushed. He had learned that the way he had learned everything that mattered in his life, not from being told, but from living carefully enough to pay attention. The land stretched out before them in the morning light, ancient and patient and gold, and the two of them sat together in the particular silence of people who no longer need to explain themselves to each other, and the day began the way the best days do, quietly, gently, and full of everything still to come. There are people in this world who will step back when they could step forward, who will offer water before they offer words, who will lay a coat down in the grass and call that enough, because they understand that sometimes enough is everything. And there are people who will find in the wreckage of what was done to them not only survival, but something they never expected to find again. A place, a morning, a second chair on a porch, a beginning shaped gently from the ruins of an ending. That is what this story is. That is what this land holds, and that is why we keep telling these stories, because somewhere, someone needs to hear that it is possible, that there are still people like Ethan in this world, that there are still mornings like this one waiting on the other side of the worst thing you have ever been through. Desert Heart was made for those people. It was made for you. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that real strength is quiet, that real safety is built slowly, that love worth having is worth waiting for, then please subscribe to Desert Heart. Every story we tell is a story worth keeping. Leave us a comment below. Tell us which moment stayed with you. Tell us what it made you feel. We read every single word you write to us, and we are grateful for every one. Share this with someone who needs it today, someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists in this world, that there are still men like Ethan in this world, that there are still mornings like this one. We'll see you in the next story. This is Desert Heart, and we're glad you're here. The significance of this story reaches beyond entertainment. It shows with honesty and without exaggeration that the most powerful thing a person can offer another is not rescue, it is respect. Ethan does not save Clara. He creates the conditions in which she saves herself. That distinction matters deeply. It reflects a truth that is rarely depicted with this kind of quiet clarity, that healing belongs to the person doing it, and the role of those around them is simply to hold the space steady while it happens. This story also speaks to the reality that cruelty often wears the face of respectability, and that standing against it requires not loudness, but steadiness. Finally, it affirms that life can begin again, not by erasing what was lost, but by allowing something true and unhurried to grow in the space that loss left behind. That is a lesson worth carrying long after the story ends.